Let me use this one for now. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for the introduction and for the invitation to join you here today. I consider South Africa already a second home, and I am always glad to come back and have exchanges with youth, young scholars, older scholars, with community organizers and others. So it's really a pleasure to be here. As Professor Brown mentioned, I've been, I came last year, I came 2 different times, and once was in the capacity as distinguished visiting scholar invited by the Academy of Science of South Africa, and during that time, I was taken to multiple universities, actually beginning here in Cape Town, and the first official presentation was at UCT, preceded by it was another presentation at UWC, but the actual launch of the tour started at UCT, and then from there to Nelson Mandela University, University of Fort Hare, University of Pretoria, Wits University, and part also of one of the offsite campuses of the University of South Africa. So this was in late February of 2019 to mid-March. And so it was an intense visit, as you can imagine, and I was very fortunate that my hosts in the different campuses arranged for conversations with an array of figures, from student organizers, student activists who had been involved in Rose Must Fall and Feast Must Fall, and are now doing graduate studies and are still involved in the universities, to deans, faculty, and at least one chancellor. So it was a kind of broad exposure to the South African, to at least a number of South African universities. And I thought that coming back again, I would offer a reflection of that visit, things that I've learned. Partly I felt myself partly as an ethnographer, visiting these different spaces, observing them, seeing the dynamics. So as much as speaking and talking as about observing and collecting ideas and impressions. And so I've talked about this in a few places, but here I am putting kind of the ideas together in a more comprehensive form, but still brief form due to the limits of time. And so this is my effort to kind of bring to young communicate, bring back to South Africans the kind of knowledge that I gather or ideas that I obtain in this process. So this is a presentation with 3 scenes and 1 epigraph. And these are the 3 scenes: identifying and opposing white innocence, white benevolence, and white arrogance. Scene 2 on Black and indigenous ancestrality. And you will notice my very strong Caribbean accent, so I hope that that's not a distraction. And scene 3, decolonial border thinking with Black love and Black rage. And the epigraph is a musical epigraph by none other than Louis Armstrong.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, a little light spiritual called Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Oh, yes, Lord. Sometimes I'm almost to the ground. Oh, yes, Lord. Oh, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah. And now,
So with this, let's start with scene one, identifying and opposing white innocence, white benevolence, and white arrogance. The concept of white innocence has been elaborated perhaps foremost by the Afro-Dutch Gloria Becker and by Huria Butella more recently. And white innocence is a form of being in the world, particularly for white people in settler nation states that believe that they have no responsibility for what their quote-unquote their ancestors have done. Kind of a liberal point of view of history, that the past is kind of canceled and the present is has foremost importance. White benevolence is a form of racial paternalism, if you will. It is sometimes described. And white arrogance, I'm going to talk about, I mean, it's pretty obvious, so I'm going to elaborate it further. There are other concepts that I could have explored, like white fragility, white rage, and so on. And I think at this point in the last, maybe in the last decade, there has been a proliferation of studies, critical studies of this kind of different forms of white reactions, constituting what I think may be called a kind of field of white attitude studies, probably. And I think that part of what I consider important about this and how I'm approaching is in terms of understanding speech acts in an anti-Black world. And so I'm operating with the idea that any speech act takes place within a racialized context where the speaker is bound to find what Huria Butella calls the white immune system and multiple forms of aggression. Right. And this is actually what is behind the first thesis of the outline on coloniality and decoloniality that some of you have read and discussed. And the first thesis is colonialism, decolonization, and related concepts generate anxiety and fear. Of course, now today we're talking about who is afraid of decolonization. So the question goes directly to thesis number one. Decolonization and colonialism and related concepts raise fear and anxiety. So who is afraid of decolonization today based on this visit to South African universities? Right, that's part of the... And the anxiety and fear, as I explained in the thesis, is twofold. It's created for two reasons. First, because these questions about colonialism and decolonization, they put in question the legitimacy of the nation state and of the value of citizenship in settler colonial societies like the US and South Africa, among others. That is, it threatens and unsettles white innocence radically, and the very legitimacy of being in a place. And second, fear and anxiety emerges and is around the subject who most typically raises the question in this challenging way. That is, the Black and the formerly and currently colonized subjects. That is their fear of anxiety about facing the Black and the colonized as someone who dares to speak, to question, to ask something, and potentially to be an agent. So what comes to mind is the end of the world. What comes to mind to this, to the white audience is feelings of revenge from the other side or the unknown. That is a word thought in different terms that could emerge after the catastrophe of colonization. And also there is fear and anxiety about not being able to control Black people. And of having to contend with Black people as contributors and leaders in the endeavor to creating a new world. Right? I still remember my landlord when I was here in 2016 as a research visitor at the University of South Africa in Pretoria, and she was a white African, and she told me, among the many things that I heard, that the problem is that here, unlike in the north of Africa, where they have culture and sophistication, the majority of Black people here don't have that. So we run a risk. They take power, they take leadership, then what is going to happen? We're going to be just like the rest of Africa, right? With the exception of North Africa. Let me see, the technical difficulties. And so that's part of the fear, anxiety, and the projection of this unknown future. Now, there are two strategies. There are several strategies of containment provoked by this fear of anxiety. One of them is continued exclusion, of course. Exclusion from the spaces, exclusion of Black people from the spaces that can offer them tools to become very effective leaders, right? And so these strategies of exclusion go from paying from high fees, from the cost of education, from lack of transportation, and also from the policing system, the juridical system, very much with a bias against Black bodies. But also it operates, another strategy of contention is inclusion. So one of it is exclusion, another one is a kind of inclusion, the inclusion into the spaces that have kind of are considered to be more sanitized, to contain the threat as much as to supposedly empower it. Inclusion in the spaces that the nation state has provided to educate intelligent leaders in the terms of the state, of course. And so how can inclusion be rooted in anxiety and fear? First, it is not because I am thinking of places like the university as places of inclusion. I am thinking about inclusion to the university as a strategy of containment, more than as empowerment. So how can inclusion be rooted in anxiety and fear? First, it is not massive inclusion. It is a slow inclusion into a space that has been instrumental to keep colonial settlement and white supremacy in place. Inclusion does not undermine white supremacy, but rather it is a key part of white innocence and white benevolence, right? Because at the end, we do our best to include them. Right? When we actually go inside, we see the third dimension of white innocence and white benevolence. That is white arrogance. That is when the students, when this population, these Black bodies, Black minds, Black subjects are quote unquote included into the university, they quickly realize that behind the white innocence and the white benevolence of working to get them into the university, there is white arrogance. And the internal spaces of the university are flourishing with white arrogance, particularly white liberal arrogance. And that has been very clear here in this context of South Africa, right? So this is Shumani Makhwele, when in March of 2015, he did his performance of throwing poo to the statue of Cecil John Rhodes at the University of Cape Town. That was the event that gave birth to the to Rhodes Must Fall movement, and then becoming Feet Must Fall. And if you go to the University of Cape Town today, you will see that the places there, the only thing is that there is no statue now. It has been removed after student mobilization. But I want to call attention to how Makhwele decides to name the statue. He writes, "Exhibit white arrogance at UCT." Exhibit white arrogance at UCT. So clearly, the performance was exposing, challenging, identifying, and challenging white arrogance. And let me read you some passages by Shumani Makhwele reflecting about his performance. He actually worked, before he joined as a student in the university, he was an unpaid researcher for the sociology department. And he said that while being in the university, he went into all of these lectures and so on, and what he found was all these white, I mean, you're going to read it now. But basically, he had this kind of exposure before he was a student even. That, of course, the experience intensifies after he becomes a student. So he says that this position of being an unpaid researcher in the sociology department introduced me rather crudely to the lived realities of being black in the white world. I went through the agonies of being black at UCT, University of Cape Town, during the public lectures and public seminars, all of which seemed to be about the lived black realities in South Africa and around the world. And yet, all these public lectures and symposiums were presented by white old men and women. By the end of 2014, I was clear about the problem and what needed to be done about it. However, I did not know what I needed to target as the symbol that represented the institutional racism at UCT, let alone the personal racism. I put safety tape around the statue, and then I started to throw the poo on the statue, simultaneously blowing the whistle and beating the drum. Campus security arrived and asked what was happening. I told them it was performance art. He very intelligently made the performance coincide with a performance festival that was going on in Cape Town. He made it appear that it was part of the same kind of effort, even though he was not officially listed as a performer in the program. I told him it was a performance art, and let me continue. It was a performance that was to last the whole day. By midday, other black students had joined me, and there, on that day, March 9, 2015, the Rhodes Must Fall student movement was born out of pain and frustration, what we later call black pain. So it's kind of black pain identifying and critiquing white arrogance directly, right? And in addition to white arrogance, there was an exhibit 2. Exhibit 1 was white arrogance, but exhibit 2 was black assimilation. So he was deploying a double critique, right? And assimilation is kind of the other side of the inclusion, right? You're included, but you're not invited to change the terms on which you are included. You're included within certain terms. So ultimately, the idea is that there can be some diversity, some variation, but the fundamental rules of the game are for you to assimilate, right? And so he's calling both sides, right, as an issue. It's a kind of, I think, a double critique with white arrogance and black assimilation as a target. And so here is kind of, I offer a kind of a clearer form what begins to appear by analyzing the performance of Makhwele and Rhodes Must Fall, the start of Rhodes Must Fall, that why innocence, why benevolence, and particularly why arrogance are targeted. Right? And then black assimilationism on the other side. But then he identifies what he calls black pain, and then obviously the agency of he involved in the performance, intervening in the white space. Right? I would add, in light of what I'm going to say later, you would understand is black love and black rage, manifested in many ways, including song, spirituality, and performance. This is what we have seen so far with Louis Armstrong, singing about the sorrow, right? The sorrow, black sorrow, which is a so-called quote-unquote Negro spiritual, and also the performance you see Machiavelli. So it's the black bodies, if you will, black subjects intervening in these spaces through performance, song, spirituality, expressing this black pain and letting it be constructive in this effort of identifying something and critiquing it. Right? So I am very interested in finding terms of, if you will, a critical theory that are embedded in the practices of black artists, black activists, black subjects, and the like. Now, when I came here last year, I was fortunate that I've been coming to South Africa before the emergence of Rose Must Fall, and then after, and I spent 3 months here precisely at the height of Feast Must Fall in January to March 2016. So when I come in 2019, I'm very familiar with all of this. Right? And I'm very familiar with the problems of white arrogance in South African universities. So when I am taken through this tour of in March, I am thinking, how do I deal with this white arrogance as I go through it, right? And I had, these are the advertisement of my first talk here. It was in the University of Cape Town, Reflections on Decoloniality in the Global South. The second one was a conversation about Rose Must Fall, but this one was kind of a public event launching my visit here. So I was thinking hard about how to intervene in a space that any speech act is encounter this white immune system and this white arrogance. One of the ways in which this white arrogance is manifested is by entitlement to voice, right? Particularly in the university space, it's taken to be a space for kind of recognition of the value of freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, and so on. And that is converted into a tool of white entitlement. So whenever there is any kind of conversation, white subjects typically feel more than prepared and entitled to go, and at any moment comment or raise questions or make questions. And typically when that happens, more often than not, I think in my experience, what you see is these questions that completely create confusion, and questions that sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally. Questions that in a way undermine the possibility of radical and deep reflection in that context. And typically, black people in the room immediately see it. Some people disconnect, some other people think that they have to respond. Once you respond, then the conversation becomes about something else, whatever it is that white person introduced, and no longer about the topics that you wanted to talk about, right? That's part of this white entitlement. So I said, well, if I go through this university, I already can predict, what kind of questions, how the debate is going to happen. So how do I effectively, or more effectively, intervene in that process? That white arrogance was still present, very much present at UCT and other campuses, was very clear, even after your Rose Must Fall and Feast Must Fall. In those days, there were these posters around the UCT campus. So, my feminism is about equal rights and opportunities, not labeling good men as trash. I feel like Marxism and identity politics are prescribed religions in our humanities faculty. Those who have a different opinion are considered heretics. I have been called coconut and sellout because I don't accept racial nationalist group thinking, right? Imagine you're using money to print and put all these posters around campus, you see? yes, black people can be racist too. Yeah. So this is that space, right? It's like the statue is gone, but still, there is still enough space for us to print our message. So what I did then was that I decided to uh, start my talk with a call, and it was in the title, the call to leave white epistemology outside the door. Right? So I was making, in that case, we did not make a request, but I was beforehand, but then I told people that they should do everything possible to leave white epistemology outside the door so that it would not interrupt the process of reflection and dialogue and so on. And what I did was that because I know that people do not hear, right? You hear or do not listen, they hear but do not listen, or listen but do not hear. I work with the Bonfire Freestyle Theater Company who helped me in the process because I want to create a space in the talk where effectively I could not tell white people, please leave the room now, I want to have a conversation only with black people, right? Imagine, next day, the visiting scholar invited by the African, did the following. So what I did was that in this moment, when I was asking about leaving white epistemology outside the door, I asked the room if they could give examples of white arrogance and of white epistemology intervening in rooms like this to discuss, so that there will be no room for doubt of what we were talking about. So at that moment, of course, only black people in the room could talk. Right? And so to make sure that we stay there, remaining with their voice, the theater company, they listened, they facilitated this part, they listened to everything that they were saying, and then they perform it. And the idea is they are performing it, but also they are doing this process is kind of a ritual process of, if you want, exorcism, trying to exorcise white epistemology by putting it in evidence in some form. Now, if you know white arrogance, you know that even this, I could predict it, but it will not be enough. It will not be enough. And so, the very first question, and then I continue with the talk. And then the very first question was by a white gentleman from the back, and he raised his hand, and he began to say, well, he was curious why it was that I decided to concentrate in differences, because in South Africa, everybody is a victim, and we need to take seriously the white suffering as much as black suffering, and so on and so forth and so forth. And it was so like exactly what I was saying that white arrogance was, that I was afraid that people would think that he was a paid actor. It was so like, and so I am there with Professor Floretta Bonseyer, who is a professor of psychology at UCT. She's going to facilitate the discussion part. And this is her face there. And this is a meme someone put. You know how creative people are with meme. That was not me. I don't know how to do a meme, but it was perfect, right? Okay. So I see, well, experiment one, presentation one, failure, right? Failure to exercise. But then again, the corroboration, corroborating the audacity. Someone in the ocean said the caucasity of white arrogance. And so I go to university number 2, Nelson Mandela University. But then I said, I'm not going to repeat this. I thought that maybe I will do it in other campuses. I will seek out actors. We'll find other ways of doing this. I said, no. Because still, the white immune system is too strong, right? It's strong. This doesn't get to the heart of it. This will not do it. So can we do this exercise better? And I thought that, well, let's begin where we should begin, which is where, saluting the ancestors. That is, when you go to a place where there have been indigenous people, and that place has been colonized. In the US, this is done sometimes. In Australia, this is done religiously, that you kind of salute the ancestors or recognize the ancestors who lived, in that place. And I was thinking, well, when you do it in the United States, typically, let's say in an urban place, very diverse and so on, and by very diverse is almost non-indigenous people around, right? So you are doing it, you're saluting kind of the indigenous ancestors, but it is not like there are many descendants of those ancestors right there in front of you, right? But in South Africa, you come, and actually the majority of the population are the descendants of those ancestors. And I mean not exactly of the Khoi and the San and so on, although partly yes. I mean of that collective black people who have been colonized and whose ancestors were here, either settled here or passed through here, right? So for me, the majority of the population that is black is, possibly, potentially can claim indigeneity in some form, right? So I said, but how do you then salute the ancestors in the context where the descendants are the majority, and yet they have been excluded from the spheres of power and the state and the economy, and particularly land, where land has been taken. And particularly when they live in places like this, right? This is the Cloete township in Port Elizabeth that I got to visit while I was there. Nelson Mandela University is in Port Elizabeth. So this is not too far from where the university is. So this is the land. So imagine I am in a university structure, and I'm going now to perform this salute to the ancestors, when the descendants of the ancestors very close by are living in these conditions. Does it make sense for me? It's not too arrogant of me to come and even think that I can salute, stand, that I have the right to come and address myself to the ancestors without, in a way, talking with the descendants. And what about, I am in this land, in a particular part of the taken land, and most of the ancestors are excluded from that space. I mean, for me, it raised very important profound ethical questions. So I talked with one of the student leaders about this, and I shared my idea, and he coincided, and I then came up with my second effort, which was no longer not to perform white arrogance to white audiences. That was a waste of time, but simply to focus on what is to salute the ancestors. But then asking the audience, whoever identified themselves as indigenous to the land, as having their ancestor there, to take a few minutes and write on paper, how do they suggest that someone like me should salute or not salute the ancestors? Right? That to tell me, because I was clueless, and I am clueless, it was not kind of a performance. It's that, really, this is a difficult situation. So why not ask them, because they are there, the descendants are there. Why not ask the descendants of the ancestors to tell me how, given their predicament and the predicament of the land and the situation, that they tell me, how should I position myself here as I begin to speak? I also talked about the Caribbean and being an Afro-Puerto Rican and my ancestors and so on. I would not go into that part here because that's not the main focus. But I wanted to share some of the responses that I got. Of course, in that part also, white people in the room were fundamentally silent, and they did not get any of the papers to, so that was a moment in kind of the performance. Now is the moment that only some subjects are the ones doing the writing, are the ones saying something, occupying that space. And because they are just writing it, whites cannot then have the opportunity to say something, right? With white entitlement, try to confront, erase, diminish, no. It is said they don't even know. Nobody knows what is written. But I want to share some of the things that were written then. We're proudly standing on our land, the land of our ancestors, Khoisan, Zulu, IsiXhosa, and all cultures in South Africa lost their lives for knowing one day it will be ours again. Rejoining the ancestral land is not only an economic cry, but however, it is also an essential and a spiritual cry. Seeing that our ancestors were tortured and forcibly removed off the land, receiving this ancestral land, not only in South Africa, but Africa, Latin America, and other parts of the world. It's an action that needs to happen radically. We need the land. The only relevant salutation is to give the land back. Return the land. Is Welethu. I did not get a translation for that one. I love that. Can you read there in the back? I will go to, I mean, there are multiple of them. We don't have enough time to go through all of them in detail, but you have the sense. Or even systematic explanations. It would be good to dance, sing, and say things in the Khoi sign language and indigenous language. Even when pay for the land you stay on, you still feel like a foreigner because of foreign laws that regulate your stay here. I believe our ancestors should be saluted by giving reparations to their descendants in every aspect of human nature. How do I salute my ancestors when I have forgotten how to salute them? I am suffering from colonial amnesia. So since then, I've been thinking more profoundly about this kind of ethics and politics of ancestrality, and what ancestrality teaches us about time and responsibility beyond the concept of history and even that of memory. Right? And I also wonder what would be, for example, a university that is grounded on a temporality of ancestrality, right? Committed to before even beginning to produce knowledge, the first act might be kind of a salutation, but a salutation in a context where the descendants of the ancestors are excluded cannot be a salutation. So before I even salute, I need to engage in a number of actions, right? So what is called diversity and inclusion, that, that's mounted on white arrogance, right? So we're trying to dismantle arrogance is by really recognizing what is it that you as a human being, how you respond to other human beings in this part of the world, and assuming that radically. Right? Now, let me go here. I want to leave you with this in your minds, and then shift to this notion of decolonial border thinking and black love and black rage. I want to continue the thinking about what are the implications of this for thinking about the university and for knowledge production. And I want to go back to one of our ancestors, the magnificent W.E.B. Du Bois, of Haitian descent, Caribbean descent, African American, and going to the source of black folk, right? That was his classic 1903 text. And the first chapter is entitled Of Our Spiritual Strivings. And it begins with a poem by Arthur Simmons, which is a white poet. And then it has some, musical notations there. And they are from a Negro spiritual that is called Nobody Knows the Troubles I've Seen. Right? So we began with one ancestor, Louis Armstrong, performing the song that another ancestor, W.B. Du Bois, selects to be in the opening epigraph of the opening chapter of his classic book, Source of Black Folk. And already in the page, you can see the proposal for a kind of production of knowledge that combines prose, poetry, music, spirituals, secular, the sciences, the whites, and the black, right? All together in one page. But he was not that he starts with this poem. It doesn't mean that he doesn't know what white arrogance is or was. This is Du Bois with some quotes that reflect his awareness of white arrogance. Blacks asked themselves, what need of education, since we must always cook and serve? And the nation echoed this self-criticism, saying, be content to be servants and nothing more. What need of higher culture for half men? Yeah. Then he also talks about a happy renaissance of university education seems imminent, but the very voices that cry, hail to this good work are strange to relate, largely silent or antagonistic to the higher education of the Negro. Then also, why the university then? Why still the university? Why is it important? He said that ultimately this responds to the longing to know that is intrinsic to any human being. Any human being, and you cannot simply let go of that demand. You cannot simply concede that demand. And the university is a space that is supposed to be a place where you develop your intellectual capacities and therefore satisfy your longing to know. Now, the university for him, he wrote explicitly of the university as an institution. And he believed that the university and the government had very important roles to play in the transformation of society to better respond to African Americans, to descendants of slaves in the United States. I said, well, we can do many activities, community engagement, all activities, but in truth, the government needs to enter and participate in a constructive fashion, and the university is the other institution that is important for us. Now, the university, as he imagined, should play at least these two roles. One, or this is why, for black subjects, this is why it's important for them to interact with the university. One is to become a co-worker in the kingdom of culture, to escape from both death and isolation, to husband and use his best powers and his latent genius. And so this includes contributing as collectives, not only individuals, to art, science, philosophy, and scholarship. And I'm citing, he uses art, science, scholarship, so on. And the second one is a function of the university to study social problems in their more complicated aspects, where the desideratum is intensive study by trained minds according to the best methods. The only competent agency is the university. That's what he believed. Now, he talks about the best methods, right? But he was also aware of the coloniality of knowledge that is part of methodology and of the disciplines. So, for example, in a passage, he wrote that a people thus handicapped ought not to be asked to race with the world. He's talking about African Americans, but rather allowed to give all its time and thought to its own social problems. But alas, while sociologists gleefully count his bastards and his prostitutes, the very soul of the toiling, sweating black man is darkened by the shadow of a vast despair. Right? So I want you to the sociologists gleefully counting his bastards and his prostitutes. Right? The kind of a social science, very quantitative social science that understands its mission as trying to quantify the Negro problem, instead of questioning the premise of the so-called Negro problem. Right? So easily you can apply methods with the wrong presumptions and with the wrong attitudes. And that method will become a tool of destruction, of legitimating exclusion and further colonization. Now, he talks about this despair, and I'm thinking that this despair, this black pain that Machiavelli and Rosemus Fall talked about, can then be served as a kind of another ground for a different form of knowledge and for a different kind of attitude that I have called elsewhere the decolonial attitude. And so it's a knowledge from black pain and despair, not innocence, benevolence, or arrogance. And then that can be the basis of thinking of forming, constructing, building another university. And Du Bois was criticized because his idea of the university and university of education and of the so-called progress of African Americans in the States was premised on the notion that the university should educate like the most talented African Americans, right? And so it was considered to be kind of an elitist notion of education. However, those things should not lead us to abandon the many valuable insights of Du Bois, including this description of his position when he was a student at Harvard University in the late 1800s. And he wrote in a memoir, "I was in Harvard, but not of it." I was in Harvard, but not of it. So talented 10th or not, the idea was that once you are in the university, it's not that inclusion to university, that is not that is not defining your ultimate goal. It's part of a process. So how do we today become can be in the university but not be of it? It's a crucial question. Now, I'm going to the Third World Liberation Front, and I'm almost out of time, so I will rush a little bit for the sake of time. Because Du Bois, he died in the early 60s, and he did not get to see the kind of major student revolts, student of color, black student revolts in the late 60s, for example. Right? He did not get to see either Rose Must Fall or Fish Must Fall either. And so in 1969, in the San Francisco Bay Area, there was what it went as the Third World Liberation Front, and it was a coalition of students with a black student organization, Latin American students, Asian American students, and Native American students coming together in what became the longest student strike in the United States. It's the longest student strike up to now in the continental United States. It has only been superseded by one student strike a few years ago, and it happened in a colony of the United States in Puerto Rico. So see, the two longest student strikes of the US university have been by students of color. One in the San Francisco Bay Area by a coalition of so-called minoritized populations and students from abroad who were in that area, and in Puerto Rico. So what does this mean then to think or rethink after these movements, right? I think that even Du Bois, if he had lived, probably he was saying, okay, here are leaders that are inviting us to think further and perhaps better the kind of university that we want. Instead of the kind of thinking about a talented 10th, it could be now kind of another kind of engagement with the university with other politics and other projects, right? And the Third World Liberation Front, they actually proposed, they demanded the creation of a Third World College, a Third World College. Like the College of Letters and Science, the College of Engineering, the College of Law, and so on and so forth. But letters and science for them clearly appear as white letters and white science. So they needed kind of a space to be able to develop the ideas, questions. You know what Du Bois said? We need a space to study these problems. We need at least this space. If you don't want to follow us, that's fine, but we want the space to do it, right? And no, the assimilating, including move is no, you belong inside the arts and sciences because the humanities are so great and the social sciences are so fine, we're going to be able to. But you ask, most ethnic studies scholars will, experience the residency in the arts and sciences, perhaps more as prisons than as, actual homes. But still, that's part of what is to be in the university, but not of it necessarily, right? And so, the last year was the 50th year of the Third World Liberation Front. And there's actually a special issue just came out now, it's an Ethnic Studies Review. 50th anniversary is a very comprehensive issue. If you are interested, you can look at it. It just came out, I think, a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, so I want you to think, and one of the things that I want to live with you, and I hope you think through this week, is this: how to be in the university, but not of the university. Of course, you don't have to be in the university. If you think that your talents are better suited and temperament and opportunities are better suited elsewhere, then use it. And likely not be of it either. Whatever you are, think that you may not be of it. You're not going to find a place, at least officially, it will be very difficult to find a place where you feel that you are really part of it and that you're in it and that you're of it. Now, think also of what is to be at the university in spite of the university, and do things in the university as a professor or researcher in spite of that university more than with the university or thanks to the university, right? And we need to embrace that from early on, because if not, we're going to spend most of our careers complaining and crying that the university doesn't do this, the university doesn't do that, the university doesn't do this, and then we forget that, well, maybe there is something to be done, right? In spite, not because of. But for that, you have to invest from recognition by the university. And that means that your interlocutors and collaborators, then you have to define them yourselves. Instead of having a discipline or a field, define them for you. And so that comes this proposal and this project that I have been working on creating zones of, border zones of decoloniality. Being in the university, not of the university, but defining that as an opportunity to engage in creating border zones of decoloniality, border zones between the university and knowledge-generating movements, activities, and spaces outside of the academy. Here in South Africa, the best and deepest form in which I have been able to do that is a collaboration with the Black House Collective in Soweto. Okay. And the Black House Collective actually served as a kind of refuge for many of the rose must fall, feast must fall students when they were kicked out of the university, when they were looking sometimes because they lived in shacks, then they were in the university, and because they were not in their shacks, when they came back home, they no longer had a home. The places had been taken, right? So they didn't have a place to go suddenly. So the Black House became one of these places where they went and discussed and so on. And so these are pictures from one of the meetings that we had there. So imagine then the collaboration from the university connecting with the Black House as a kind of priority linkage, right? Like you want to really build knowledge from platform of Black pain, Black sorrow, but also Black love and Black rage. Believe me, it will be very difficult to do it simply within the university. And Black love, I mentioned it, but it's one of the principles of the Black House. And in fact, I've done, as a director of the Rutgers Advanced Institute for Critical Caribbean Studies, I co-participated, our two organizations, the Institute and the Black House, in the creation of a camp of Black consciousness and decoloniality for youth of between kind of 12 and 16 years old. And so we began to think about a Black House collective paradigm of decolonizing knowledge, power, and being. And so what we've done is we have combined, the Black House collective is driven by two major philosophies, the Black consciousness and also Pan-Africanism. So what we have done is link that with theorizing of decoloniality, kind of international theorizing of decoloniality, and particularly with the Institute Caribbean. So Caribbean and South Africa, kind of radical thinking, Fanon, Biko, and so on, they coming together in that project. And that's what we're trying to elaborate. And when I came here, also what I did in my presentations in this university was to present some principles of a Black House paradigm of knowledge production. So this is actually the title of one of the leaders, Sandy Hadebe. And she's here presenting because also I brought her to Rutgers, and we did a conference there on the spirit of Bandung and decolonizing knowledge. So it goes both ways, right? Building ideas. Then we co-edited a volume, a special issue just came out on decoloniality, Fanon decoloniality and the spirit of Bandung. And she's one of the co-editors, also with Mireille Fanon Mendez-France, who is the daughter of Frantz Fanon. And so these are some of the principles that I began to elaborate also in my talks, in addition to do the performance part that I began to present in dialogue with the activities with the Black House. I cannot go now in developing each of them, but give you an idea, a list of the effort and the direction. And these are some practical recommendations that I suggested on the basis of the work with the Black House Center for Critical Studies on Liberalism. I think liberalism has to be taken up critically because it's a refuge for white innocence and white benevolence. And there is a presumption that liberalism is the complete opposite of fascism and apartheid. And I think that can be interrogated and dismounted in multiple ways. And we need more of that kind of studies, right? It's not so much diversity, so let's take liberalism seriously, critically. Institutes for Black Consciousness and Decoloniality, and you can find different subtopics to do, right? So if you're an agency looking to fund, or a university looking to open spaces to invest, right? You don't have to create these kind of ad hoc task teams, right? Immediately the universities responded that way. The students are asking for decolonization, but what is that? How to figure it out? And they brought professors to then think about what is decolonization, and then decolonization turned to be, one formula, one paper that is circulated among faculty. I've been told that that's done in some universities here, where they said, well, this is the formulary of decolonization. Tell us, how many people of color are, how many readings by people of color are included in your syllabus, right? And it becomes a mechanical thing, right? Mathematic things. That's usually what these kind of teen task projects do. But what is to really talk about decolonization and decoloniality in relation and in dialogue with movements, even out of the university, that are perhaps best exemplifying that. You have to decolonize expertise then also. And then also we suggested transdisciplinary projects that involve constructive linkages with communities and youth programs and decoloniality summer schools. And actually this week, the University of Cape Town is going to have its first decoloniality summer school that is being organized by the Black Academic Caucus. It's an organization of faculty, Black faculty and staff that emerged in response to Rosemont's fall as part of the unfolding of organizing and activism at the UCT campus. And they have been functioning since 2015, 2016, and the very first decoloniality school is going to begin on Monday by this group. And we're also talking about the possibility of having other Black academic caucuses in other universities in South Africa, right? So this is a conversation that we have been having since a number of years ago, and this is coming to a fruition. So that's some of the ways in which you are in the university, but not of it, and where you create zones that are, even though when they take place in the university, are not only or primarily even with university, experts, but rather with plural communities. And so there are many things that can be done as long as we have the right attitude and we avoid the white immune system and white arrogance. Thank you very much.